Welcome to week 5. This week we will be talking about communication around assessment. So we've certainly spent a lot of time talking around the different types of assessment, the analysis of assessment, large scale, small scale, formative. And so this week we kind of bring together how we talk about and the issues around communication. So we think about our objectives this week, really the last week. So what you're really thinking about is, being able to communicate around formative assessment, interventions, and what multiple assessments mean, and how to talk about that with adults and other teachers, especially when we think about the Pennsylvania Department of Education standards aligned system, which is all about the standards, curriculum, intervention, teacher evaluation, which is what we'll focus more on in that this week, as well as the school's performance profile, which right now, of course, involves that large scale assessment data. And should that change, that would make some of this content outdated, but we'll talk about what exists right now. Your pre-assessment, we really be, you're kind of spread out there in the middle with communicating assessment results with administrators. And here you can talk about teachers you're a little bit more comfortable with, parents and community, kind of right there in the middle. And then when we think about students, some of you feel really good about that. Some of you are still kind of thinking, what's that look like? And then, interestingly enough, this PVOS, SPP, and teacher evaluation, we're kind of leaning more towards the left. So we'll spend some time on that later on in this week's content. So our essential questions, we think about how can data be effectively communicated to a wide range of constituents, right? And how do you use that communication to focus on student growth, student achievement, and that cycle of continuous improvement? And so, really what you want to be thinking about is really a key idea in this week is how you, as the instructional leader, are scripting the narrative of your data for all those stakeholders. So, what you don't want to do is let the data tell the whole story. The data shouldn't be what people see as the main thing, and so you're going to have to use other communication strategies, whether it be your school has a Facebook page and you're posting all the great things that are going on during the day, or Instagram or Twitter. That's a small part of it, as well as the website and the newsletters, and what parents see and hear when they come to the school for the first time, because that's the narrative that you are driving with the data. So this week, you're watching this short introduction now, and I've broken it out into 4 small parts. One being assessment students, one being assessment parents, administrators, and teachers. And then in the conclusion, I'll kind of touch upon what you're doing with the final. So before I kind of give you the walkthrough of what the week's going to look like, just want to talk about some problems of practice around assessment to kind of frame the work and why we're talking about this this week. We know that assessment can be contentious or controversial. We know that there are people who really believe in grading. And just to be clear, assessment and grading are 2 different things. Okay, assessment informs us, grading is more of a report. And so that those 2 things, if confused, can create problem for parents or for teachers, especially for those who really buy into that idea of grading. You're going to have to be cautious in how you frame that work with the colleagues that you're with. Some will be more relatively easier to talk about than others. We know that assessment can evoke fear, right? So for parents, this is often the case where they're afraid that their child won't get into something as a result of assessment data. So they won't get into honors, or they won't get into AP, or they won't get into the college they want, or if they don't pass this math test in 5th grade, they won't get to pre-algebra earlier. And there's all these kinds of things that parents will, come at the school with when they're fearful for their child. Um, what we think about teachers, what if my students don't perform well? Right now the teacher evaluation system has teacher data in that, as well student learning outcomes as well as the testing data. So this is, a fearful thing for teachers as well, or just looking bad that, my class didn't do as well as the person across the hall from me, and why, right? And then students, that fear if they don't do well, that they're not maybe good enough, smart enough, and so there's that really, kind of self fulfilling prophecy for some kids when they get into a cycle of failure. And so, if I can connect you back to the last thing you read in week 4, that short reading about, the use of assessment to improve and continuous progress, right? So we'll want to be keeping that in mind as well. We know that assessment can privilege certain groups. And so that is why the state has really, in the school performance profile, really targeted the historically underperforming subgroup. So those students who typically are low socioeconomic, they're in special education, or they come from certain demographics. So those things put students into a group, and the state and the government saying they need to be making achievement regardless of their background. And so, how do we go about doing that is something that we're going to want to keep in mind. Um, Mentioned this already, but we know that, standards versus grading. So if you're a school district that does standards-based report card, you probably have dealt with this or are dealing with it. A student could potentially be meeting all the state standards, but failing or maybe getting a 70%. Use an example, I had a ninth grade boy who was failing English. And when I looked at his eighth grade PSSA and ELA, did quite well, and he was failing because he didn't turn in his work in ninth grade. So that wasn't. So grading can be a misleading factor. And likewise, student could be getting 100 on their grade and not meeting the standards for a variety of reasons, whether it be that they didn't understand it, they didn't get it, maybe they got too much extra credit for the grade. So the two can be confused, and it's somewhat problematic if a student's always getting a 70 on their tests, and you'll go up all throughout the year, and you think, well, what they passed the course, but what didn't they get in that content? We know assessment can be isolating, and we've talked about, how teachers are often assessing and grading alone, and really we want to move that practice towards looking at that in a collaborative setting in order to improve the program as well as increase student achievement. And if you haven't read Rick Wormelli's work on fair is not always equal, we know that what one student sitting in front of me may need could be very different from the person next to them. And so we want to be thinking about how we can be fair with our assessment practices. So before I give you an overview of the week on D2L, I wanted to bring your attention to one last piece, and that would be the observation and practice that's used to evaluate teachers by Charlotte Danielson. And I just want to point out some of the assessment components to frame this week's discussion. So this is domain 1, planning and preparation. And so this is where we have outcomes based on what we want students to learn. That our outcomes can be assessed effectively. We also know that when we look at domain 1, coherent instruction, right? And that we have materials and activities that are effectively planned for our learners. And here we have 1F, where it's designing student assessments. And so assessment criteria and standards are clear. The teacher has a well-developed strategy around formative assessment and so forth. And so you can see here that these are components in the planning portion when you're working with teachers. Here we have the domain 3, which is the instructional domain. And you can see this is, students should be fully aware of the criteria they'll be assessed on, teachers monitoring those students, giving high quality feedback, that students are assessing their own performance against the performance standards. And then finally, when you look at domain 4 and professionalism, the teacher has a system for maintaining those records, all those assessments. We think about communicating progress with families, and they're engaging them. And so we'll talk about parent engagement this week. And so these things are part of the teacher evaluation, actually a big bulk of it. So you're going to want to, if you don't have these in front of you on a frequent basis, they are things that you should have. They're part of your evaluation. So in week 5, I'll have the introduction posted here, and when week 4 ends, I will make sure to post the questions. But you'll see here's the introduction, and here's the second part to the introduction. And so there's then a SMART goal. So after you watch these 2 videos and you have read that article, for the week, I'm sorry, if you've done the reading, here's just a resource you can go back to from last week on SMART goals. But part 1 really has no deliverable per se, just kind of set you up for the week. And here we are in part 1. There's a short presentation, and then there's a Google Doc regarding communicating with students. And so you're going to want to pick a partner. And so hopefully if you filled out that sheet in week 3, you can email someone in class and try to, set up to be your partner. So if I put my name here, I'm going to put a couple sentences about how school communicate with students on assessment. And then, what's one area you can celebrate in your school, and then what's an area you could strengthen. And then your partner will type their name here, and then they'll give some feedback based on what you've written. And so it's just an idea to get us in the conversation around communicating with students. Part 2, we'll go into parent communication, and you'll watch a video, and then there's a short self-reflection, comes right out of the book for you to take. So it shouldn't take long. This next part talks about the SPP. And after you watch the video here, I'm going to send you to view some different school districts' presentations regarding their data. And the 5th district, you should go and look at your own. If you don't have one, then you can use the one from my district. And then I'm going to ask you to take a look at the SPP. And then this will lead into the discussion for week 5. And so these questions will really address what you viewed in part 3. And so I moved the discussion earlier, knowing that this was the last week, and I certainly didn't want to wait until the end to have your discussion posting. Part 4, there is a short, about 13-minute video on the teacher evaluation. And then there's a 30-minute at the most, it took me 23 minutes, little tutorial on the TBOS. And at the end, you'll get a certificate, and I ask you to save the certificate and upload that into the weekly assignment folder when you're completed, as kind of you're like, I've done this and had a chance to look at that. And then you'll notice that I put in 150 minutes in this section. So this is really, you're looking at the most 45 for the video in this tutorial. There are 2 videos here that I've put here optional, but maybe what you want to do is while you're working on some other things for class is to pick one of these and have it playing kind of in the background, that you can kind of look at it periodically and catch some key things. I think there's some useful information on here. So I've kind of, it says a longer time, but I planned that so that you can kind of just have it on and pick up things while you're working on some other projects for class. And if you don't get to it, that's something that you might want to look at when class ends, when you're not as focused on trying to finish some things. Lastly, here's you have the conclusion. You'll have the, and it'll explain the final, but there's a case study here that you're going to read, and you're going to write a 1-page response for your final and upload that on D2L. In this case study, you might want to read beforehand. It'll give you just some ways to be thinking about how you can write in your final.